The Colorado man suspected of killing his pregnant wife and their two daughters is expected to be charged today. Officials have not yet revealed the motive behind why the 33-year-old allegedly killed his family.
And photos and videos of the Watts family on social media appear to paint a picture of a very happy family. So how do investigators find the clues underneath those seemingly perfect images in order to crack the case? Here to give us a little bit of insight is Mary Ellen O'Toole. She's a retired FBI profiler as well as the program director of George Mason University's Forensic Science Department. Mary Ellen, thank you so much for joining us. I think, one of the things that has sort of one of the reasons we're so fixated on this case is because of the social media images, that they just look like this perfect family, and she looks so happy with her husband and he with her. How is social media going to be used by investigators here?
That's a very good question, and investigators will be going through both the mom and the dad's social media to see what they're posting, what the commentary is, but they'll be comparing that to information that they receive when they do their interviews with people that knew the family closely. Because what we do know is that oftentimes what people put on social media is not really what's going on in their life. So in other words, we had cases all the time in the FBI where
some crimes are not just about violence, but about erasure. Chris Watts did not simply kill his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their children, Bella and Celeste. He attempted to erase them, from his life, from his future, from existence itself. In one night, he tried to annihilate his family, his responsibilities, and the identity he had built as husband and father. For the outside world, Chris seemed like an ordinary man in an ordinary American suburb. He smiled in photographs, posed in family videos, waved at neighbors in the driveway. But beneath the surface, he was living a double life, one built on secrets, silence, and detachment. He was dismantling his marriage piece by piece, erasing intimacy, erasing responsibility, erasing truth. By August 2018, the mask began to crack. Financial strain weighed heavily. His affair gave him a fantasy of escape. His marriage, already fractured, left Shanann increasingly desperate and alone. To those who knew her, Shanann was strong, outspoken, resilient. To Chris, she had become another reminder of the life he wanted to abandon. And so he chose not repair, not divorce, but erasure. What makes this story so haunting is that his attempt to erase failed. Shanann's voice did not vanish, it remained preserved in thousands of videos and texts. His daughter's memories were not silenced, their faces, their laughter, their innocence live on in the public imagination. The very digital world Chris tried to escape has made his crime unforgettable. The family he tried to erase has become immortal, their story replayed across the globe. This documentary is not about retelling the night of August 13, 2018. That has been dissected endlessly. Instead, it is about the deeper question: why did Chris Watts devote so much of his life to erasing? Erasing conflict. Erasing intimacy. Erasing the people who loved him most. And why, despite his efforts, do those he tried to erase remain more present in our collective memory than ever before? Because erasure is never complete. Truth has a way of surviving, even through silence. And in the case of Chris Watts, what remains speaks louder than what he tried to destroy. The Watts family lived in a neatly kept home on Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado. From the outside, it was the image of middle-class stability, manicured lawns, smiling family portraits, two children with another on the way. On social media, Shanann's posts captured birthdays, vacations, declarations of love. To friends and neighbors, Chris appeared quiet, dependable, the kind of man who blended easily into the background. This was the mask of suburbia, a curated picture of happiness, hiding fractures no one could see. The truth was that Chris had already begun erasing himself from the life he helped build. He detached from his wife, withdrew from conversations, avoided intimacy. Shanann sensed the void and tried to fill it with energy, optimism, and digital documentation. She shared everything online. Family moments, affectionate captions, daily gratitude. What looked like joy was also an effort to hold something together that was already slipping apart. Behind closed doors, silence dominated. Chris spoke little, even when confronted about finances, family conflicts, or his growing emotional distance. Instead of engagement, he gave detachment. Instead of solutions, avoidance. He erased his voice, leaving Shanann to carry the weight of every problem. She texted him, pleaded with him, wrote out her fears, and received only fragments in return. The mask of suburbia stayed intact for the neighbors and the internet, but inside the house, intimacy had already collapsed. Financial strain deepened the deception. Their dream home came with mounting debt. Bankruptcy loomed in their history. Bills piled quietly, another secret Shanann struggled to solve with relentless optimism. Chris responded not with confrontation but withdrawal. He erased the anxiety by pretending it wasn't there. The more their problems grew, the more he disappeared. By the summer of 2018, the divide between image and reality was cavernous. To outsiders scrolling through Shanann's Facebook feed, the Wattses looked enviable. To those reading her private texts, the marriage was hanging by a thread. This is the paradox of digital suburbia: the brighter the smile, the deeper the shadows can hide. Chris's mask fooled many. Even in the days after the murders, he stood on the porch, calmly speaking to reporters about his missing family, his voice flat, his expression unreadable. He had been erasing himself for years, and by then, there was nothing left behind the mask. The tragedy of the Watts case is not only in what was destroyed, but in how easily erasure hid in plain sight. The mask of suburbia was not a cover he put on in one night. It was a slow disappearance, an erasure of self that left behind only the shadow of a man who no longer belonged in his own life. By the summer of 2018, Chris Watts was no longer content with silence and detachment. He had begun constructing an entirely new identity, a double life. At its center was a relationship with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. On the surface, it was an affair. But beneath it, it was something far more dangerous, an act of erasure. With Nicole, Chris was not the quiet, withdrawn husband carrying debt and family conflict. He was a man reborn, free of obligations, free of fatherhood, free of the weight of Shanann's expectations. Their relationship was fueled by secrecy, by the intoxicating sense that he could start over, erase the past, and step into a fantasy of freedom. The digital record tells the story plainly. Chris began searching for apartments, looking up song lyrics about escape, Googling how much child support might cost after divorce. Nicole herself searched for wedding dresses, for information on Amber Fry, the mistress whose testimony exposed Scott Peterson. Their phones became the blueprints for an alternate life, one that existed only in fragments of text and imagination. This compartmentalization was not new. Chris had been erasing parts of himself for years. But with Nicole, the erasure became complete. Every moment with her deepened the divide between his old life and the fantasy of a new one. In Shanann's presence, he was cold, detached, silent. In Nicole's presence, he was attentive, engaged, alive. The two selves could not coexist. One had to be destroyed. Psychologists describe this as the all-or-nothing trap of certain personalities. Instead of facing conflict, instead of integrating the realities of responsibility and desire, they choose annihilation. To keep the fantasy alive, Chris had to erase the reality. Divorce would not give him the clean slate he wanted. Divorce meant confrontation, debt, custody battles, exposure. Erasure meant total freedom. Nicole has insisted she was deceived, that she believed Chris was separated and on the verge of divorce. Investigators never charged her with wrongdoing. Yet her presence remains controversial. For some, she was an unwitting accomplice to a man's fantasy of erasure. For others, she was the accelerant that exposed the hollowness inside him. 7 years later, the affair remains a symbol of the double life Chris built, and the lengths he would go to protect it. He was not simply cheating on his wife. He was erasing her, erasing his children, erasing the very life that no longer fit the fantasy. And in that double life, the seeds of annihilation were sown. Before the affair, before the crime, there was silence. In the Watts marriage, silence was not peaceful. It was corrosive. Shanann's text messages in the weeks leading up to her death reveal a woman pleading with her husband to open up. She asked him why he no longer touched her, why he avoided conversation, why he seemed like a stranger in his own home. She wanted answers. What she received was detachment. Chris's silence became its own form of control. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't confront. Instead, he withdrew. When conflicts arose, about money, about his parents, about the children, Shanann faced them alone. His passivity was not neutral, it was abandonment. Every silence was a message: I will not fight for this marriage. I will not stand beside you. The most visible fracture was his parents' strained relationship with Shanann. The argument over Cece's nut allergy, trivial on the surface, became a symbol of something deeper. Shanann demanded boundaries to protect her children. Chris, unwilling to confront his family, retreated into silence. For Shanann, this was betrayal. For Chris, it was avoidance. In the end, silence solved nothing. It only widened the divide. Financial strain compounded the collapse. The Wattses carried debt and a history of bankruptcy. Their home, impressive from the outside, was weighed down by bills. Shanann tried to fight through optimism and work. Chris shut down. He erased financial stress the way he erased conflict, by pretending it did not exist. Friends of Shanann later said she felt alone in her own marriage. She described herself as carrying the weight of love, parenting, and survival with little support. The silence in their home left her exhausted. She continued to fight, but she was fighting by herself. This pattern of silence may help explain why Chris's betrayal was so devastating. Shanann was not only blindsided by an affair, she was suffocated by years of distance. In text after text, she expressed her heartbreak that the man she had built a life with was no longer present. Her words reveal a woman who loved fiercely, but who increasingly sensed that she was loving into a void. 7 years later, the silence in their marriage feels like a warning. Not all violence comes with shouting. Some of it begins with withdrawal, with avoidance, with the quiet erasure of intimacy. Shanann's tragedy was that she recognized the silence too late. By the time she put her fears into words, the man beside her had already erased himself from the marriage. And when people ask how Chris could erase his family in one night, the answer may be that he had been erasing them slowly for years. His silence was practice. The final act was only its cruel conclusion. When Chris Watts was first questioned, his mask held.
I'm gonna find him, right? I need your help. When we find the guy who took him, what do you think we should do?
This is what is known as a behavior-provoking question. An innocent person will usually give what is known as a draconian response. They will immediately respond with the harshest sentence possible for the crime they are falsely being accused of committing. A deceptive individual will often give an equivocating response. This means that they will fragmentize and divert from the question to a certain degree, as a means to avoid responding to the query in its entirety.
They're gonna come home safe, correct? When you find the guy. When we find the guy, they're gonna come home. Life in prison would be that's what I would think with 2 kids that are involved.
He told investigators he had no idea where his wife and daughters were. He appeared calm, collected, rehearsed. Standing before cameras, he pleaded for their safe return. But behind the scenes, contradictions were already unraveling his story. The first fracture came during his polygraph test. Investigators told him plainly, "You will not pass this test if you are lying." He agreed, confident. Minutes later, the machine revealed the truth he could not hide: his calm exterior was deception. The man who claimed ignorance was carrying knowledge too heavy to conceal. Confronted, Chris shifted his story. His first so-called confession blamed Shanann. He told detectives she had killed the children, and that he killed her in retaliation. This lie was as cruel as it was calculated. It erased Shanann's dignity, painting her as the destroyer of her own family. Forensic evidence would dismantle this claim, proving his guilt. But in that moment, he attempted one last act of erasure, erasing her memory by rewriting her as a villain. Later, when the evidence became overwhelming, he admitted to killing them all. Yet even then, his words contradicted reality. He described losing control, acting in rage, blacking out. He insisted it was not planned. But investigators found searches on his phone, financial steps suggesting a planned escape, and an affair he had concealed. His contradictions revealed not confusion but calculation. Even in prison interviews months later, his story continued to shift. He claimed he heard voices. He claimed Shanann did not resist, that she simply cried quietly as he strangled her. To some, this detail sounded like honesty. To others, it was his final erasure, denying Shanann even the dignity of resistance, as if her silence made his crime less monstrous. Experts in criminal psychology warn us, offenders often reshape their confessions to maintain control. Every version Chris told served a purpose. The first blamed Shanann. The second softened his intent. The later versions blurred memory, leaving space for doubt. His contradictions were not truth, they were strategy. 7 years later, the cruelty of his confession still echoes. Shanann was not only murdered but defamed by the man who killed her. His shifting stories robbed her of voice, agency, and truth. And though the evidence has long since spoken louder than his lies, the contradictions remain, a reminder that even in admitting guilt, Chris Watts never stopped erasing. His crime was annihilation. His words were manipulation. And in both, he revealed the darkest truth of all. For Chris Watts, confession was never about telling the truth. It was about keeping control, even as the truth slipped beyond his reach. Chris Watts tried to erase his family, but in the digital age, erasure is impossible. Shanann left behind a living archive, thousands of Facebook posts, dozens of live videos, endless text messages. She documented birthdays, school runs, doctor's visits, even quiet moments of gratitude. Each clip, each post, each line of text now forms a digital diary. And that diary has outlived the man who tried to destroy it. In her videos, Shanann beams with pride. She films Bella dancing in the living room, Celeste playing in the yard, Chris smiling quietly in the background. She praises him as a father, thanks him for his support, tells the world how lucky she feels. These posts were her way of holding on to joy, even as the silences in her marriage grew heavier. They are also her testimony. They show the life Chris erased, and the love that makes his betrayal incomprehensible. But Shanann's private words tell another story. In texts to friends, she wrote about her fears, her loneliness, her heartbreak at Chris's distance. She confided that she felt unwanted, unloved, abandoned in her own home. When she discovered suspicious credit card charges, she realized her worst fear was true: her husband was building a life without her. These words, preserved forever, reveal the collapse that unfolded long before the final crime. Today, her digital footprint has become haunting. Millions of strangers watch her videos, listen to her voice, read her texts. Some do so to honor her memory. Others search obsessively, looking for clues, signs, warnings. Shanann has become both victim and digital ghost, endlessly present, endlessly replayed. Chris may have silenced her in life, but in death, she speaks louder than ever. There is a cruel irony in this. Chris tried to erase his family to create freedom for himself. Instead, he ensured they would live forever in the public eye. Shanann's optimism, her resilience, her desperate attempts to hold her family together are now immortal. Bella's giggles and Celeste's wide-eyed innocence are frozen in time, preserved against his attempt at annihilation. The Watts case is often described as a story of murder. But in its digital afterlife, it is also a story of survival. Through video and text, Shanann's voice cannot be silenced. Through memory and mourning, her children cannot be erased. Chris wanted a clean slate. What he created was an eternal record of what he destroyed. 7 years later, the digital ghosts remain. They remind us not only of what was lost, but of what survives. Chris Watts erased lives. But in the end, he could not erase love, laughter, or legacy. Those traces are still here, speaking louder than the silence he left behind. 7 years have passed since the Watts family murders, yet the story refuses to fade. Every year, new documentaries, articles, and online debates resurrect the case. Unlike other tragedies that recede into the past, this one lingers, because it was never just about violence. It was about erasure, and erasure leaves scars that will not heal. Chris Watts sits in a Wisconsin prison, serving multiple life sentences. In interviews, he drifts between regret and self-pity, admitting guilt yet still reshaping details. His story changes depending on who asks the questions, but the core remains the same: he annihilated his family to pursue a fantasy life that never existed. The contradictions in his words still echo, leaving unanswered questions about his motive, his state of mind, and his capacity for cruelty. For Shanann's family, the wound is permanent. Her parents and brother have had to live not only with her death but with the public spectacle of her life being dissected by strangers. Every post, every text, every photograph has been examined, sometimes with compassion, sometimes with cruelty. Their grief has been magnified by the world's fascination. For the public, the haunting lies in the ordinariness of it all. Chris Watts was not a monster in appearance. He was a neighbor, a coworker, a quiet man in a polo shirt who blended into the background. His mask of normalcy forces us to ask, how well do we really know the people closest to us? How much can we trust appearances, photographs, curated social media feeds? The Watts case unsettles us because it happened in a place that looked so safe, with people who looked so ordinary. And then there are the digital ghosts. Shanann's videos still circulate. Bella's and Celeste's faces still appear in true crime thumbnails. Their voices, their laughter, their mother's optimism, these cannot be erased. Chris wanted freedom from the weight of family, but in destroying them, he created a legacy that haunts him still. The family he tried to erase became immortal in memory, their stories shared endlessly, their names never forgotten. 7 years later, we still return to this story because it reveals something uncomfortable about ourselves. It shows how silence can fester inside a marriage. How fantasy can drive people to annihilation. How digital life can preserve the voices of the dead in ways no one intended. Chris Watts tried to erase everything. What he left instead was a record too powerful to ignore. And that is why the Watts case endures. Not because we need another story of true crime, but because it forces us to confront the truths we would rather erase, that betrayal can live beside love, that silence can hide in smiles, and that even in the age of erasure, nothing is ever truly gone. Chris Watts believed he could erase his family, erase his past, erase himself from the life he no longer wanted. But erasure is never complete. Shanann's voice lives on in her videos, her laughter preserved on countless screens. Bella's and Celeste's innocence still echoes through home movies replayed across the world. Even baby Nico, who never drew a breath, remains a name that cannot be forgotten. What Chris tried to destroy has only grown louder. The family he silenced has become immortalized in memory, in archives, in collective grief. Their story endures because love leaves traces, and traces cannot be erased. 7 years later, we are left with lessons we cannot ignore, that silence can be a weapon, that fantasy can become annihilation, and that betrayal from within a home is the most devastating of all. If this story touched you, don't let their memory fade into silence. Subscribe to this channel to stand with the victims, share this video so their story reaches further, and add your voice in the comments below. Every click, every share, every word keeps Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico alive in memory. Because in the end, remembrance is not passive. It is action. It is resistance against the silence that tried to erase them. And it is how we ensure that their names will never, ever be forgotten.